Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on Shining Spears, the infamous, fantastic, and fabulously finicky Eldar fast attack unit that is without a doubt one of the best target elimination units available to Eldar. And in fact, I am going to go so far as to say that there is nothing better in the Craftworld's Codex for target elimination. Spears are, I think, first equal with anything, maybe the best. They may be the best. It's certainly true that if you look at Craftworld's detachments that have done reasonably well in 9th edition GTs, and here I'm saying Craftworld's detachments because there have been very few pure Craftworld's lists that have been able to pull ahead in the world of big competitive tournaments. But we've seen Craftworld's detachments appearing in mixed Eldari soup lists that have done well in GTs, and the vast majority of those use spears, right? They're an excellent unit. They're also a very, very difficult unit to use well. What I'm going to do in this video is run you through two different spear builds that I think are the most optimal currently for the 9th edition meta, how to go about setting those up with reference to Exarch powers and custom Craftworld traits, and how to think about spears on the table but before you play. And then we'll also, later in the video, we'll talk about movement and tactics and how to think about your spears while you are playing. I'm also going to talk a bit about Samhan spears. So it's not just those of you I felt, even though I am talking to you from the past and you're in my future, nevertheless, across the gulf of time, through the currents of the warp, your sinking spirits when I said custom Craftworlds. I felt it, Samhan players. I know. I get it. You're supposed to be the Jetbike Craftworld, so surely your spears should be the best. Your spears are very good. Samhan spears really are strong. They're good. They can advance and charge. They have they can reroll failed charges. Both of those are enormously powerful advantages. So I will also talk about Samhan spears, even though I think the sort of ugly truth is that they aren't quite as good in most lists as some of the custom Craftworlds builds that are available. So that's the plan. 3 different builds: movement, tactics, how to think about them on the table. And to you veteran spears players who are already doing extremely well with your spears, I am just going to come out and say it's possible, maybe even likely, that you won't learn anything. I hope that that's not true. I hope there's at least something in this video that you can take away and say, okay, well, maybe I'll try that in my next game. I hadn't thought of that. But this is not Space Elf Sun Tzu revealing something about spears that nobody knows. This is just me trying to help players who are maybe either new to Craftworlds or new to the idea of competitive 40K, make spears effective at a time in the game when they are really one of the most powerful tools we have, and yet they're really hard to use well. And before I dive in, just a quick story about my own return to the game. I got back in at the very end of, or the very beginning, I guess, of 8th. I think I was playing maybe Necromunda at the very end of 7th. I don't know. I was playing some Warhammer game at the very end of 7th. But at the very beginning of 8th, I got back in with some friends who were already playing, and they're very good players, which I didn't know at the time. I was so excited, and I just took a kicking for in every game I played for the first 2 months. I thought I had a good list, right? I had all of these units that had been good back in 3rd edition, and units that I was painting up that I was excited about, that I thought should be good, and it didn't go well. And when I rethought my collection, and I started at this point, I think I have multiples of everything in the Codex and most of the Forge World stuff, and so there's a lot of opportunity to build lists in different ways. But like many of you, right, when I was getting back into the game, I was dealing with a limited unit set, and one of what I thought the solutions was going to be to my performance issues was to pick up some of the units that the internet was saying were competitive. And at the time, if you got it on Reddit or whatever, everybody agreed that Shining Spears were great. I thought, okay, this is what I need against Thousand Suns. I bought a couple of boxes of Shining Spears, and I just took a kicking. It made no difference. They seemed like an overcosted trading unit. I would run them into something on turn one. They would do a little bit of damage, but not that much. They'd die, and then I'd be right back where I started. So, in the hopes that you can avoid my perilously unpleasant learning curve experience and hopefully get some competitive results with your Craft Worlds lists at a time when that's hard, especially for newer players, we're going to do a deep dive on spears. Here we go. Okay. So you'll see that right now what we're looking at on the table is, I'm afraid to shake the camera, but I think they're all on screen there. 12 Shining Spears, 2 units of 6 that can easily be further broken into units of 3. And I've done this by designating sort of backup exarchs with, I've made these pennants and capes. Right, there's a guide. If you're interested in how to do that, there's a guide on my website. If you go to the blog section and scroll way down, there's a DIY Shining Spears, pennants, and banners thing. It's super easy. Now, I think you're going to find that running your spears in 3s or in 5s or 6s is really the optimal way to do it. If you're running them in 3s, here it comes. You're not going to like this, some of you. Expert Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics, that's the first build. So the first build we're going to talk about is MSU spear units. So 3 spears, minimum sized units with an Exarch, 2 regular spears. You give the Exarch the upgraded laser lance, so the Star Lance, and that rolls in right at 110 points. And with Expert Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics, that unit is absolutely, without a doubt, one of the most points optimal target elimination units. It's so good. It's so good for its points. MSU units of Dark Reapers, where you give the Exarch a Reaper launcher and Rapid Shot, and Crafters, that too, right? That's kind of probably at first equal with this, but in terms of paying, 110 points is just not much, right? It's like 5% of your list, and then what you can do with that unit is pretty fantastic. So that's what we're going to start with. Okay, so the way this particular build functions in your list is you probably, I will talk about an alternative to this, but probably is you set up this unit to be an objective counterpuncher that has additional utility against smaller, high-threat enemy target elimination units that are quite aggressive. And against those units, it needs to be in combination with other things. So if you're using this 110-point build with Expert Crafters and Hunters and Ancient Relics, what you're actually looking at is a squad that on an objective in melee hits slightly harder than a 5, what might be like a typical 5 elf unit of Shining Spears, right? Because what's going on is your Exarch natively has 3 attacks. Now with Hunters of Ancient Relics on an objective, that's going to go up to 4 attacks, and that's with the upgraded lance. So those are strength 8 attacks instead of strength 6 attacks, as is typical with the other lances. And then you have each of your other spears, who would normally have 2 attacks each, because of Hunters of Ancient Relics on an objective, contributing 3 attacks each. So what you have is 10 attacks, 6 of which are at strength 6, 4 of which are at strength 4, with a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound. Now, one of those rerolls to hit is almost certainly going to the Exarch, which basically amounts to 5 strength 8 attacks that hit on 3s, that with minus 4 AP will go through. See, this is one of the great things about spears, is that minus 4 AP is such that their attacks go through a 3-up armor save. So lots of Space Marines with their 3-up armor save. There are lots of vehicles with a 3-up armor save. Most conventional armor in the game, so non-invuln armor, they just ignore it. And then they're doing flat 2 damage, and that is just devastating. It's huge, right? They're incredibly potent against enemy heavy infantry like Marines. They're super good against cavalry, enemy bike units, right? If your opponent has something like spears, you know, some fast, aggressive unit, maybe Drakari Reavers or Hellions or something, if you hit them first, right, that flat 2 damage that essentially goes straight through armor at strength 8 and 6, it's devastating. Your odds of wiping the unit are significant. So that melee damage output, you're adding 1 attack to each spear, so 3 additional attacks with Hunters of Ancient Relics on objectives, increasing their damage output right there by close to 50%. And then when you add in Expert Crafters, it's a little bit more than 50%. So that's taking them up to having 50% more, as though they had 50% more units, more models in the squad. They hit a 3-man unit at 110 points that hits as hard as a 5-man unit, which would have set you back 180 points. If you just think about the math there, it's very easy to see why these are so effective at target elimination. And that's just in melee, right? So they also, if they're within 6 inches, they can also shoot with those lances, which basically adds an additional attack at each of those weapon profiles, so strength 8 and strength 6 respectively. And each one has 4 shuriken shots, so they have 12 shuriken shots, and that gives them additional utility against, especially against light infantry and hordier units, right? So the flat 2 damage on the spears with the sort of 10 attacks initially plus the 3 shooting attacks, that's obviously teched for heavy infantry. I mean, it certainly does fine killing things like demonettes or gene stealers or termagants or guardsmen or something, but it's not necessarily an optimal use of that firepower. But when you add in those 12 shuriken shots now they have utility against heavy infantry, cavalry, and also light infantry. They hit so high above their pay grade. I think I'm mixing my metaphors. Fabulous. It's a fabulous unit. So that's the argument for the 3-man squad in terms of damage output with crafters and hunters. And again, you can get a similar, without running Hunters of Ancient Relics and Expert Crafters, you can get a similar damage profile by running 5 spears, but now you're at 180 points instead of 110 points, and that is a huge difference in the cost of the unit relative to its utility. The other decision that you have to make, so if you're running these 3 elf squads, the other decision that you have to make when you set out to set things up is what Exarch power you're going to assign. So the native Exarch power, Expert Hunter, allows the Exarch only to reroll wound rolls against tanks and vehicles. And this is pretty good. There was actually a GT list. A lot of people swap this out. I usually swap this out. I've just shaken the table, sorry. But there was a recent GT list which ran, I think, that did well. I think it was in the top 3. I can't remember which GT it was, but it included a unit, some MSU spear units in which the player had kept Expert Hunter. And it's good for the following reasons. So spears aren't natively great against hard targets, T8 targets, really anything that's T7 and above, because the lances are strength 6th. You can make them effective against those targets. One of the things we're going to talk about in this video, target priority with your spears. But to do so, you need to use Doom or Empower, right? Doom allows you to, your Farseer casts it. If you don't know what Doom is, you're a very new Craft Worlds player indeed, but I've started, so I'll finish. Your Farseer casts it on an enemy unit, and your Craft Worlds units can reroll all wound rolls against that unit. It's one of the biggest damage multipliers in the game. So that's the strength 6 weapons that sort of struggle to wound these T7, T8 models. They really either need those rerolls, or there's a Runes of Battle power called Empower, which gives your melee, a single melee unit, +1 to wound, and then of course that makes your regular Shining Spears effective against those higher toughness units, because now they're wounded in on a 4+. The Exarch with the Starlance, which you should absolutely, it's 5 points, right? And it takes the difference between strength 6 and strength 8 is significant, because in these higher toughness targets, the 7s and the 8s, instead of wounding them on 5s, now you're wounding them on 3s and 4s respectively. And that's a big shift. And because your Exarch is making one more attack than these other models, and because with expert crafters you're likely to use the reroll on the Exarch if necessary, therefore increasing his attacks effectively really by one more, the Starlance has already gone a long way to giving this unit utility against these harder targets. And so with expert hunters, you increase that even further because now he's rerolling all of his wound dice. So if your Exarch can hit with everything and then wound with everything, he can do some significant damage to a tank or a vehicle. And so that's why that default Exarch power, that's what that was there for. It was to give a unit that's really teched to be anti-heavy infantry and anti-cavalry some utility against harder targets, such that in combination with something else, maybe your spears could eliminate one of those targets, maybe. Now, Psychic Awakening has created additional options for spears for a couple of reasons. One is the Runes of Fortune power, which we'll get to later, Ghostwalk. But there are these Shining Spear Exarch powers in Psychic Awakening that can either replace Expert Hunter or, alternatively, for 1 CP, you can take Exemplar of the Spear Shrine, it's a stratagem, and take something in addition to Expert Hunter. With these MSU units, I typically just do the swap. I don't think it's worth the CP. Craftworlds is a pretty CP-hungry army, and I think you're better off, if you're not going to use Expert Hunter, just making a change. And there are a couple of options here that are I think obviously the best, and depending on your own style as a player, I think you're probably either going to want Skilled Rider, which is the one that I usually go for, or if you're planning to deep strike with these spears, you're going to want something called Swooping Dive. And I'll talk a little bit about the other ones also, because this is a unit-focused video on Shining Spears, but we'll start with why I think these other two really are your best options if you're not going to do Expert Hunter. So the one that I use most, Skilled Rider, increases the invulnerable save of the Exarch from a 4+ to a 3+ against shooting, right? So one of the eccentricities with Shining Spears is that they're one of the only Craftworlds units to have a native invulnerable save, but that invulnerable save is only against shooting attacks. And so what you get is a unit that's pretty robust, especially if you buff it with Protect and or maybe Fortune, is pretty robust against shooting attacks, but just folds against a dedicated melee unit. You don't, and when we talk about movement and tactics, we'll talk about why it's imperative that you never let anybody charge your spears, because that's the end of your spears, and they will not do significant damage. So Skilled Rider gives that extra +1 to the invuln save of the Exarch, and this means that if you also cast Protect on the unit, I've talked about this, I think, like 17 other places on the website and the videos, so sorry if this is redundant, if you've watched them all, but you can get that Exarch to a 2+ with Protect, and so as you're taking incoming fire that has decent AP, you can assign that incoming fire to the Exarch, and hopefully you don't roll 1s, and that makes this squad hugely robust against shooting while it's getting into position. Also, with this small squad, the MSU squad, it's just with that 3-up invuln save and then maybe the 2-up invuln save, it hugely disincentivizes your opponent targeting it at all with shooting attacks, because even if your opponent is able to eliminate it, unless your dice are very, very unlucky, the amount of firepower that your opponent will have to put in to the unit relative to its cost at 110 points to first chip away at the Exarch and then take out the other models is often pretty significant. And you know, if that happens, it's probably a win for you, simply because that firepower has been diverted away from other targets. So again, I like Skilled Rider. It also gives you the ability to, on a backfield objective, let's say you have a unit of, say, Storm Guardians with Celestial Shield and maybe Protect, holding some backfield objective and your opponent sort of overcommits to shooting the Storm Guardians off the objective, a small unit of Shining Spears that you have in reserve with Expert Rider can move on to the edge of that objective, still stay out of range of most things in your opponent's army, and just be hard to shift and sort of annoying to shoot at while they're waiting to play a different function in the battle. Now, some of you are probably bridling at this. You're like, no, why would you hold your spears back? They're a go unit. They fly chivalrically across the battlefield and slam into. That is what they do. You use Quicken and you catapult them on turn 1. Haven't you noticed that the GW standard sculpts are wearing medieval French jousting armor? Do you know nothing, Brent? Well, angry player, I will say 2 things to you. 1, yes, I am impressed with your knowledge of history and armor and your attention to detail. That's cool. But also, there are probably better ways you could be using your spears. So that turn 1 sort of spear torpedo where you send 9 shining spears up the field, and then you quicken them, and then you charge your opponent while you cackle madly. That was popular for a hot minute back in 8th edition, and there might have been meta reasons why that was working for people. And I think people who play in more casual metas or they're playing the same 5 people against certain kinds of units, that works maybe really well for them. But I will tell you that in competitive play, if you're playing against a variety of skilled opponents with good lists, the turn 1 9 spear torpedo is the first big trap. Like, I am not going to talk about that build because it's not points efficient, and I think it's, again, in higher level play, I think it's just going to get you into trouble, because what happens is you even assuming you succeed on that, right? You succeed on Quicken and you get them there. Typically, you're hitting a wise opponent, seeing 9 spears on the field and knowing that Quicken exists as a power, is going to be able to insulate key units, the units that you would most wish to engage with those spears, from a turn 1 charge. So what you end up charging is some chaff unit or some unit that your opponent absolutely is willing to trade for those spears. And it is a trade, because what happens is you hit that frontline unit or whatever it is, your spears absolutely devastate it, and you cackle madly at the success of your cavalry charge, and then your opponent wades in with a dedicated melee unit or dedicated HQ melee unit and just annihilates your Shining Spears, which are T4 with 2 wounds and have no invulnerable save in close combat. And so, and if you just do the math, if you look at the sheer cost of that 9 elf spear squad at like 300 points ish, there's very little that you can kill on turn 1 that an opponent is going to allow you to kill on turn 1 that warrants that kind of trade. And then it's not even resource intensive to eliminate. So if that's what you were planning, if you recently got into Craft Worlds and you bought 3 boxes of spears and you're planning this French army at Agincourt cavalry charge, regardless of the circumstances, that may be a lot of fun in narrative play, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that if that's what you want to do, but there are definitely better ways to play them in competitive games. It's just true. So this 3 elf spear unit is not a suicidal turn 1 charge unit unless it is, right? Because this unit is so cheap. Here's the other thing. The problem with the 9 elf charge, again, is that spears really are a trading unit. That, with the exception of that one function that I just identified, where an MSU unit of spears with Expert Rider can sit on a backfield objective, they are a trading. There's no unit in the Craft Worlds Codex that makes you feel more like you're playing chess than spears, right? You're getting them into position, you wait for your opponent to position some unit, you trade your 110-point spear unit for the 140-point obsec unit or the 160-point aggressive melee unit or whatever it is, and you do that. You've got 3 spear units and you do this 3 times, and it gives you an edge on points on the table, it gives you an edge on board control, it gives you an edge on primary objectives. They're hugely useful. That's really, I think, that's how spears want to be used. They're designed from a game design perspective, they're designed to be a trading unit. So the advantage again to these small squads is they're cheap. So the skilled rider power that lets you move up the board and position them while you are preparing for a charge. And even still, you're going to try to keep them out of line of sight. And I'm going to demonstrate some movement later in this video, and we'll talk about how to do that. So the other power that you might consider is Swooping Dive. Okay, the 5-elf squad is my preference for Swooping Dive, and instead of the skilled rider build, and the reason is because I think a 5-elf Shining Spear squad is serving a slightly different function in your list, right? So the MSU Spear squad is teched and optimized for eliminating enemy units on objectives. That's what it's there to do, and I don't necessarily have to worry about being able to get into position with them anywhere on the table, because they're fast enough, they have enough movement that I know I can get into position with them on midfield objectives any turn I want, probably. And what they're really for is punching, first and foremost, is punching enemy units off midfield objectives. So I tend not to give Swooping Dive to my 3-elf squads because they don't need it. I occasionally do, right? Sometimes if I expect I'm going to run into certain things in my meta, there might be like these outlier circumstances. But usually, I think they do better with Skilled Rider, in part because they just don't need that positioning option, because they have a very specific job that doesn't require them to deep strike, and that's hitting enemy units on midfield objectives. That's what they're teched for. The other reason is that in terms of the way my opponent thinks about whether or not it's worth shooting at the squad, right? If I have a 3-elf squad and they have Skilled Rider, so the Exarch has a 3-up save, and I have the option of casting Protect on them to give them a 2-up save, that's a huge deterrent for my opponent shooting at them at all, right? Like, it's kind of win-win for me, because in order to kill the Exarch, the opponent probably has to overcommit resources. I already talked about this, to eliminating 3 bikes. So probably it gets ignored, and then that's a win because the squad's a great build, or a great tool. So it's a win either way. The 5-elf squad is a bit different, right? If in a 5-elf squad, maybe it is worth my opponent chipping away at that Exarch to eliminate the other 2 models, because it's just scarier looking on the table. It's 180 points in my list instead of 110 points in my list. It just makes more sense, right? Also, I think with the 5-elf squad, you're often thinking more broadly about what you want your spears to do. So instead of being specifically for punching enemy units off midfield objectives, the 5-elf squad is expensive enough that it either doesn't want to trade once, right? It wants to eliminate 2 units. So you wait for an enemy unit to get out of position in a place where you know you can kill it and be okay. So or maybe you just lose 1 elf or something. So you kill it and then you get to act again. So that's one option. Or because it's so expensive, you still use it as a trading unit. But what you can trade it for reasonably is reduced, right? You definitely want to trade for something of equal or greater value, and hopefully, in addition, tactical necessity on the table, right? And that's just harder to do with a 180-point unit than it is with a 110-point unit. So, and it all comes down to positioning. And because deep striking the elves gives you greater options, more options for positioning, I tend to lean into Swooping Dive, the Swooping Dive Exarch power for my 5-elf squads. I guess I should say what Swooping Dive actually is. So, Swooping Dive is a Psychic Awakening Exarch power that replaces Expert Hunter, or along with it for 1 CP, that gives a deep striking Shining Spear unit +1 to charge only in the turn that it deep strikes. Now, initially this looks like a crappy deal. You might be thinking, why would I ever do that? That's an Exarch power that gives me +1 to 1 roll on 2 dice once and does nothing on any other turn. Well, skeptical future viewer, I understand your skepticism. And on its own, yes, you are right. On its own, that is not enough. What takes it over the edge is a synergy that exists with another Psychic Awakening option, and that's Ghost Walk. So if I'm deep striking a unit of 5 Shining Spears and I need them to be able to successfully charge their target, and that target is something that probably has to die, then that is a pretty clutch tool in my list, and it's an expensive tool. I need to succeed, and there's a Runes of Fortune power. So if you're not terribly familiar, or you don't have encyclopedic knowledge of all the Psychic Awakening stuff, Ghostwalk is a Runes of Fortune power. It replaces Smite. That's what the Runes of Fortune do. You have the option to replace Smite, and it gives a Craft Worlds unit +2 to charge in the turn that it came in from Deep Strike. So what this means is, if you get a Warlock into position, and it wants to be a Warlock, for reasons I'll go into in just a moment, then when your spears arrive, 9 inches from your target, between Ghostwalk and skilled Swooping Dive, they now have +3, which takes them to a 6. And if you are a Settlers of Catan enthusiast, like most people who play any games at all, or if you just play a lot of Warhammer and you know about dice, you know that the average roll on 2d6 is a 7. So more than 50% of the time you will roll a 7 or better. So Ghostwalk alone will take you to more than 50%, right? But if you also have Swooping Dive, if you just need to get a 6 or better when your spears arrive, suddenly, especially if you keep a command reroll in your back pocket, getting to at least a 6 on 2d6 that you get 2 tries for, that is sufficiently likely that you can now build that into your strategy in a way that is not a huge gamble. Obviously, it's dice. Everything is a gamble, but it is no longer a significant gamble. The Ghostwalk on its own, it's merely probable, but you do surpass this threshold when you get to 6 up. Now, you can actually get to 5 up, right? If you also take the custom Craft World trait Headstrong, which gives all of your units an additional +1 to charge, well, now they would only need a 5. That really would be, if you have a reroll in your back pocket, that would really be all but certain. It is my opinion that there is no build in which Headstrong, there probably is some build, I'm probably wrong about this, but the combination of Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics is just such a fabulous damage multiplier for spears that, I mean, I guess maybe you'd keep 1 and swap in Headstrong, but that combo is so powerful that I think that if you're running custom Craft Worlds and you're focused on a detachment that's a melee oriented detachment that includes spears, it's just hard to make room for Headstrong. But it is an option. It's another possibility. It's something you might want to do. So these 5 spear units are different from the 3 spear units in that they aren't narrowly focused on punching enemy units off of midfield objectives with like the option to maybe do something else less optimally. Suddenly, because they have the same damage output as that 3 elf unit against anything on the table, really a greater damage output because they have more shuriken fire. It's a tool that offers you a wider variety of options. Because it's more expensive, it's less forgiving if you don't use it well. So you need to think about really not making mistakes with this unit. It takes some getting used to, because a lot of competitive opponents will be very good at knowing that your spears are in deep strike and screening the things that they need to screen. And so as you're shooting with your other units and thinking about target elimination, you need to think about making a hole to bring in your spears. Or when you decide whether to put them into deep strike at the beginning of the game, you have to look at what your opponent is running and work out, is my opponent going to be able to afford to leave models in his backfield to screen me out? Or is he running Custodes and he just doesn't have enough models for that? Or, you have to think about what the game is going to look like on turns 2 and 3 when you have the opportunity to bring in deep strikers. And so in that sense, I think the 5 elf units, not only are they more difficult to use effectively, or not only are they more expensive, but they're more difficult to use effectively. I think they are as good if you use them really, really well. But it's just much harder. So if you're new to spears and you're having trouble using them well, my suggestion is to start with the MSU build and then start experimenting with the Swooping Dive deep strikers once you have the hang of the MSU build. I think that will be more rewarding. One last note on deep striking your spears. The lances, right? The shooting profile for the lances, they only have a 6-inch range, and so one disadvantage to deep striking the spears is they 100% give up any opportunity to shoot with the lances on the same turn that they charge. That's a serious problem in terms of math. If you haven't allowed for it, like with reference to the target and how much damage you need to do. All this means is that the tactical gain of deep striking the spears has to outweigh an additional 5 attacks, right? And that said, sometimes you move your MSU 3-spear crafters, hunters, spears, and they are out of range for the lances too, and charge, and it's fine, right? It's really the melee damage. That's what we're really counting on. But it is a consideration. It is another reason to think twice about the deep strike build. And it sounds like I'm discouraging you from the deep strike build. I'm really not. I use it a lot. I like it. I have been leaning into the MSU start them on the table build more, but it is very good. It's harder to be effective with it. And so if you do try it and you don't immediately get good results with it, don't assume that that's because it isn't effective. It's just, it's not easy, right? It's very, very finicky to use well, especially against an opponent who's very skilled at screening deep strikers. So something to think about. All right, Samhan spears. Some of you are thinking those aren't Samhan spears in the image. Those are the shining spears you've already shown us. True. My stuff is all painted in either standard-ish Aspect Warrior schemes or Ibrasil. Or actually, I do have a bunch of Ulthway stuff that is a super simple paint scheme that I wouldn't show you because it's not that cool, but I use it for tournaments where you need differently painted detachments when that's a thing. But I don't have any red ones. Sorry. If Samhan is amazing in the new codex, maybe I'll paint up some Samhan spears. But I have in the past sometimes run my Ibrasil paint scheme as Samhan. So there's that. Samhan spears have 2 advantages over not Samhan spears. The first is that the craft world, the Samhan craft world trait allows units that fail charges to reroll charges. So you have this built-in reroll. You can, in theory, do it with a bunch of units in a command reroll, right? You can do it on one unit, but because it's standard, you don't spend any CP, and you could do it with all your units. And so their charges are much more likely. That's cool. The other advantage to Samhan spears is that there is a stratagem that allows them to advance and charge, which makes that turn 1 charge in particular significantly more likely, which is great, right? I think they're not, again, the sad truth is they're not as strong as the custom craft world options. Especially now in Psychic Awakening, the ability to use Swooping Dive to get +1 to your charge, and Ghost Walk, right? You really can get your spears into position to charge, and they're so fast anyway that, frankly, with Quicken is so much better than Advanced Charge anyway. It's still good. I shouldn't talk it down because you poor Samhan players. This is supposed to be your signature unit. Actually, I think Wind Riders are your signature unit. For reasons, but it's certainly your number 2 signature unit. So they should be amazing, and they are good. They really are. They're fast, and those charges are more reliable. And when you're doing something like setting up a 7-inch charge, which is slightly touch and go, it's so much more likely when you're running Samhan spears, which is great. In practice, does this lead to playing them significantly differently on the tabletop? Not really. Again, because you don't have access to expert crafters and hunters of ancient relics, I think you're probably not running MSU units. I think you are probably running them in 5s or 6s at least. I think the 9-elf unit. I mentioned the 9-elf turn 1 charge. I think that's generally a mistake, and I think having more than 7 is also generally a mistake because really for the same reasons that I identified when I was talking about trying to run 9 spears, they become so expensive. Every time you add, they're 35 points a model. So every time you add another spear, the stuff, they are a trading unit. The stuff that you can trade them for economically sort of decreases rapidly. Every time you add another spear to that unit, it becomes a worse deal for you to trade for all sorts of other units in the game. So the trick with spears is to build out your unit just to be just big enough to be an optimal trading unit, and then you think ahead about what sorts of units you want to be able to trade it for, and so, you know, Samhan, I think we're looking at 5 to 7. Probably, if you do want to start them in Deep Strike, you could take the Exarch Power, Swooping Dive. But if you're going to do Ghost Walk and you've already got the free reroll, maybe you gamble a little and you take a different Exarch Power to make up for not having something like Crafters or Hunters of Ancient Relics and increase the damage output. And I think that this is a good opportunity to talk about 2 of those Exarch Powers that I haven't talked about yet. I might as well talk about all 3. So we've talked about Swooping Dive and Skilled Rider and why those are really good. We haven't talked about Lancer, Heartstrike, and Withdraw. Of those, I think Lancer is the best, and particularly for Samhan Spears, trying to add a little bit of extra killiness, I think it's a good option. Tragically, it's not as... Lancer is at its best when you're running it with Expert Crafters and Hunters of Ancient Relics, which I'll explain now, I guess. So what Lancer does is 6s to wound. When the Exarch rolls a 6 to hit, it generates an extra hit. And there are lots of powers in the game that do this, right? 6s generate extra hits, or in some cases, extra attacks, right? Supreme Disdain is an Eldar stratagem where, 6s generate extra attacks. And I should have said earlier in the video, anytime your Shining Spears, if you don't have Lancer especially, but anytime your Shining Spears are charging a unit and you've got a reasonable number of spears, or 3 with Hunters of Ancient Relics on an objective, if you're rolling... I think if you're rolling, say, at least 8 dice in melee, and it's touch and go whether or not you can eliminate the unit, it makes sense to play Supreme Disdain, which is a 1-point stratagem that causes 6s to generate extra attacks. Now, what's cool about Lancer is that 6s just generate extra hits, and because the Exarch has 3 attacks instead of 2 attacks, in, say, a Samhan detachment of Shining Spears, if you do have Lancer, there is a 50% chance that your Exarch will generate an additional hit, and because his or her or their weapon is strength 8 and has a -4, we'll go through all the spears are -4. Nevertheless, the chances of that going all the way are pretty good. Say it's against Space Marines. The Exarch with the strength 8 wounds Marines on a 2 if they haven't played Transhuman Physiognomy. So an extra hit, and it goes straight through Marine armor. So an extra hit is probably just an extra dead Marine. So it's good. The reason that it's better when you're running Crafters and Relics is that your Exarch now has on an objective 4 attacks instead of 3 attacks, and Crafters basically adds up to being at least as good generally as having 5 attacks. And so the chances of generating at least 1 additional hit, pretty darn good. And the chances of generating 2 additional hits, not bad. So Samhain can make good use of Lancer because they don't necessarily, especially coming in from Deep Strike, because they don't need to mess around with Swooping Dive necessarily. It's still helpful. It makes it more certain. Or maybe you're starting them on the board, but you're not worried about Skilled Rider. Instead, you're just keeping them out of line of sight, and you're relying on making a slightly longer charge. Lancer is a good pick. It's not as good as it is. Man, I feel... Samhan, I'm sorry. Samhan players, I'll stop saying it isn't as good as it is. It's good. It's good for you. There's still a good argument for choosing Swooping Dive and Skilled Rider, but Lancer is a solid option. I would recommend against Heartstrike. So what Heartstrike does is instead of generating an extra hit, it just generates an automatic single mortal wound. Now, initially this might sound better, right? Because it's 1 mortal wound and it's definite. The reason that I think it's not better has to do with the sorts of units that your spears are targeting. The ideal target for your Shining Spears is a unit of bikes or heavy infantry with 2 wounds per model. Or some bikes have 4 wounds per model. That's good too, but some sort of even increment of 2, right? I guess everything even is an increment of 2. Because with weapons that do flat 2 damage, then every failed armor save is a dead enemy. And you can see, therefore, how just doing a mortal wound, like say you go against Marines and you're trying to wipe them out with your spears, well, an additional mortal wound gets you literally nothing, because that gets you a wounded Marine that, if then is hit by a spear, just takes 2 damage and it kills it outright. But even if it didn't have the mortal wound, it would have been killed outright. So Heartstrike really just, I mean, occasionally it could come through for you, but for the most part, I think it's really not. It doesn't make mathematical sense based on the way your target priority is going to work with this unit. The other power that I mentioned, Withdrawal, I didn't mention Blade Master. So if you are one of the 7 people in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and I heard there's one in Europe somewhere, who built his Shining Spear Exarch with a Paragon Saber, it makes the damage characteristic of the Paragon Saber 3. The argument that I just made about Heartstrike holds here. Now, flat 3 damage, to be fair, as I said, I think in my last video or some recent blog post, in some ways, flat 3 damage is the new 2 damage. There's a lot of stuff that wants flat 3. It's good. But it's not usually necessarily what your spears are going to be targeting. I guess, I haven't really thought this. I guess if you had a bunch of MSU spear units with Exarchs, with Paragon Sabers, and you were really just relying on the 3 damage, there's some build there, right? Maybe there's some way to do that. But probably you don't have Paragon Sabers on your spears, so it's probably not a thing we even need to talk about. The other option is Withdraw. So Withdraw looks good initially, and I think there are even some places online where sort of credible people who review this kind of thing, whom I really respect, have said, Withdrawal is an A. I think Withdrawal is a solid C minus. And the reason that I don't, so what Withdrawal does is it allows a unit of spears at the end of the fight phase to make a 6-inch move as though it were the movement phase. Now, this sounds initially like it might be really good for the following reason. Spears only hit hard on the charge, right? Their strength 6 and strength 8 damage profiles. You have those when you charge. Otherwise, they're operating at like strength 3. So if you make a big cavalry charge with your spears and you fail to kill whatever it is you charged, and now you're just engaged with it and it's still healthy and robust, well, next turn you're in a lot of trouble, right? Because I think, so that means I could withdraw 6 inches and then I could charge something else. Practically, though, that's not how it's going to shake out, because the counter to spears is melee, right? Your opponent doesn't want to shoot spears because then they have an invuln. And if you have an Exarch with Skilled Rider, you've got a great invuln. So the counter for spears is to charge them first. And when they are charged first by a dedicated melee unit, they crumple. They're T4 with 2 wounds per model, no invuln in melee. So against good, like not against just some rando Marines, but against good, and even rando Marines can really mess them up. But against a good dedicated melee unit, they're done. So the notion that you would, if you could withdraw their movement value like 16 inches, yeah, maybe there would be an argument for it. Harlequins have something like that, and Harlequins get to do it before the enemy has even punched back. Yes, great, sign me up for that power. But Withdraw, I'm going to move 6 inches. I'm on top of my opponent, and I'm going to move 6 inches from the unit that I am engaged with that I have failed to kill, and think that I am still going to be alive next turn to fight. Probably not. There might be situational circumstances in which you can do this, and should you find yourself in one of those, just use the stratagem that lets you do it. Right? We already have a stratagem that lets us do that for one unit. So I think there's really no situation in which Withdrawal is a good pick. Maybe in some sort of 500-point play with an MS, maybe. But even then, I don't think so. So same Han Spears function much like I think the 5-man units of spears or the 3-man units of spears that I just talked about. You can either deep strike them, or you keep them out of line of sight in your deployment zone. And this is I think how you use all spears that don't deep strike. And you wait for an opponent to move into range and counterpunch them, or you move them carefully up the board. You keep them totally out of line of sight. And I will demonstrate this a bit later in the video. And you think about the movement range of your opponent's melee units, and you make sure that your spears are not likely to be charged, but you keep them hidden and you get them into position, and then you you make a play, and you trade them for something advantageous tactically, and certainly tactically, and maybe also points wise. You have one other option with Samhan spears that you don't have with other spear units, or I think is not a good play with other spear units, and that's to run them with an autarch running the Nova Lance of Samhan. In a recent blog post, I talked about the ways to play the mainstream craft worlds and how they can be just as effective on the table as custom craft worlds, and the relative advantages and disadvantages of each. And the Nova Lance of Samhan is fantastic. If you're interested, if you're a Samhan player, and that's not a Shining Spear thing, it's an autarch thing, so I'm not going to go into detail about it here. But if you are a Samhan player, have a look at my article about, it's called Of Ulthwé and Edgelords Playing Without Expert Crafters. The Nova Lance is really good, and it makes sense maybe, right, to stick an autarch on a bike and have it travel around with a unit of, say, even 4 Samhan spears, or 5's good too. You don't need as many with the autarch, and just really wreck stuff, right? And suddenly those Samhan spears can bat way above their normal value, targeting T8 targets and really doing some damage. And the autarch, of course, also provides rerolls of 1 to hit and in the shooting and the fight phase to the spears that he's traveling around with, and that is pretty great. Now, I don't think, if you're not a Samhan player, I do not think having an autarch travel around with your spears, an autarch on a bike with a laser lance, makes a lot of sense, for the simple reason that you could buy 3 more spears for the cost of that autarch. And so him conveying, he can't take a non-Samhan autarch cannot take some badass relic that is better than a star lance. He just gets a strength 6 laser lance, and yeah, he hits on 2s, but he's not as good as having 3 more spears in the unit, I don't think, especially when you start thinking about maybe the other buffs that you could put on them instead of having an autarch there. So the Nova Lance autarch as an escort, or really you can think about your spears as an escort for him, super powerful option, and definitely worth considering if you are playing Samhan. If you are not, regardless of whether you're playing Samhan, if you are not running MSU units of spears with expert crafters and hunters of ancient relics, if you are running 5 or 6 or 7 spears and you are running some other craft world or some other custom craft world, you can hugely increase the efficacy of your spears as a tool with psychic buffs. So I think I mentioned earlier in the video that if you cast Doom on your target, right, the ability to reroll rolls to hit or to wound, right, against T7 and T8 targets, can suddenly your spears stand a reasonable chance of destroying an enemy tank, or an enemy monster, or something like a Demon Prince, which they may have really struggled to do before. Empower, also, again, super useful. It's a Runes of Battle Power that gives them +1 to wound. So instead of the autarch, right, the autarch, that's a bad deal. There are the reroll ones to hit. Okay, but frankly, being able to reroll all your wound dice or having +1 to wound, that's probably better. And there's also a Runes of Battle Power that gives you +1 to wound, which is also really good. So if you're looking for a bonus, that's how to do it. It's not spending enough points that you could have added 3 spears to the squad, right? Instead, we're going to think about these bonuses as an option. Okay, to finish up here, I'm going to demonstrate some of the basic first turn principles that I was just talking about, show you some movement. As in the primary objective video, I feel a little bit odd at this point because I just said the thing and now I'm going to show you the thing. And but some people are visual learners, so here we go. So when what I've done for this demonstration is I've assumed an MSU spear build. So I have 2 3 spear units on the table. I would generally run 3. Occasionally I run 2 squads of 3, but I think 3 squads of 3 is often better. Incidentally, when you're putting spears into a list, there's nothing to stop you from running 2 detachments with different bonuses. And so I know some, especially players who maybe haven't played since 3rd or 4th edition, or who are back to the game after a long time, it can feel incredibly janky and power gamey to run 2 detachments with different sub-faction bonuses from the same overall faction. For some people, like that's for some people who are not already like competitive tournament players, that is just it seems like this, I don't know, uncrossable emotional line that just, it seems too douchey to consider. If you are playing in tournaments, the culture of the game is such that that is not the case. You know, maybe in your local game store, or with your friends who are playing more narrative games, that would be frowned on, and in which case, don't do it. You know, this is a thing that we do to have fun. And I have a blog post and a video all about the difference between competitive and casual 40K, and how you have to think about these types of play differently. And part of that is being sensitive to what are essentially the cultural norms of any individual meta. But in terms of the global competitive meta, if you are interested in playing the game more competitively, it's fine. It is, nobody is going to bat an eye at you running 2 detachments with different bonuses, even 2 custom craft world detachments with different bonuses. It should be possible to tell which units are in which detachment. You can do this by, the easiest way is to paint the band of the base a different color or something. I don't know why suddenly I feel like I have to talk you into this, but I think because the video is aimed maybe at players who have less experience with spears and maybe less experience with competitive 40K, I feel like this could be a stumbling block. But one option that exists for you is to run 2 detachments in your list and make one of those detachments, say, if they're both custom craft worlds, maybe expert crafters and masterful shots, and maybe the other one is maybe a vanguard detachment with, say, expert crafters and hunters of ancient relics, and this is where you have your shining spears and maybe your wraith blades with axes, and maybe even something like a wraith seer, perhaps. I don't know, any of your dedicated melee units, or units that are likely to participate in melee. But anyway, so let's say you have 3 units of MSU spears and some detachment. I have 2 on the table, but you would think about movement with all of them in the way that I'm about to demonstrate. So we've deployed such that our spears are completely out of line of sight. Now the table, you can't see all of it in this image, but it's I've taken some of the terrain off so that you can just see the board a little bit better, but it's set up from a game I played a few days ago. I can't remember the name of the mission, but there are 5 objectives with one directly in the center of the table. And I'm looking to those. Essentially, everything is to some degree a midfield objective. This is a good mission for spears. They're all good missions for spears. And what I've done is I've positioned my spears in range of the objectives that are closest to my deployment zone, but completely out of line of sight. These spears here don't look completely out of line of sight, but if you measure, this piece of terrain does meet the 5-inch requirement to be completely obscuring. And so, even though you can, see the model technically, the footprint of the terrain piece is line of sight blocking. What we usually do in my local meta is, it's not the purple sand, but it's the footprint of the ruin itself. Not that you need to know that. So I have 2 units of spears totally out of line of sight, and at this point, if my opponent gets first turn, great, right? Potentially my opponent will move into range. If my opponent is trying to grab objectives with fast units, then what I'm going to do first turn with my spears is probably pretty obvious. If that doesn't happen, what I need to do is, either because my opponent doesn't get first turn or my opponent just doesn't have those types of fast units, I need to look at what my opponent has in her army and then make decisions about how close I can get to the mid board. So one possibility is my opponent has some stuff that's super fast. So maybe there are some Harlequin bikes or Drakari Reaver bikes, or maybe it's AdMech and like 5 units started in the middle of the board by performing pre-game moves, and the table's already full of them, or they can get there. But if my opponent is not in a position to engage in melee on turn 1, if I move forward a bit, what I may want to do to get into position is move these spears such that they're still out of line of sight, but they are repositioned to be closer to my opponent, to be a threat in a different position on the table. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make an advance, and I know that they're not charging this turn, so I'm completely comfortable making an advance move. So this first set of spears here, I'm going to make an advance move. I've rolled a 5. Oh, my bad. Spears always they ride the wind. They always auto advance max range. So we're going 22 inches, and that's going to get us into line of sight, just on and slightly ahead of this objective, but behind this other line of sight. Just not to base off. Behind this other line of sight blocking piece of terrain. Again, you only want to do this if you can be reasonably confident that your opponent doesn't have access to a unit that's fast enough that can jump them in melee on her turn, because as we've already established, spears are terrible at melee when they don't initiate it. So you'll see they're out of line of sight, but there is a firing lane this way, right? So in theory, my opponent could move some unit into that firing lane and shoot at them. And this is where, again, I've taken some of the terrain off the table. So ideally, you would want to position them on turn 1 such that that is not the case. But if it is the case, this is where Expert Rider is helpful, right? So if I'm looking at these spears and I see, okay, they're likely to be subject to fire from an opponent, maybe that's the squad that I cast Protect on, right? My second squad of spears behind this Eldari landing pad, Capitol building, whatever it is, will make a similar advance move. And again, I have more than enough from the back model in the unit to move into the back of the midfield and hide behind this other line of sight blocking piece of terrain. Again, because these models, terrain models, are over 5 inches tall, they have the obscuring keyword, which means that the model blocks line of sight even if you can still, see the tip of the jet bike or something. So my Farseer and my Warlock are going to hang back. But now, what I might do is use Seer Council and cast Protect on this unit. Oh, I'd want to make sure, I think Protect is 18 inches, so I would have to move a little bit to make sure that I'm in range to cast Protect. That's a thing. So you'll see that this unit of spears is potentially vulnerable in this firing lane. This other unit of spears it's very unlikely. If my opponent doesn't have a unit that's fast enough to get into melee with them, my opponent probably also doesn't have a unit that is maneuverable enough to create a firing lane on that unit as it's positioned. And so that's not the unit that I'm going to cast Protect on. But what I've done is I've taken these spear units and I've moved their threat range forward, right? And again, in a lot of games, you're not going to need to do this. We are imagining a situation in which my opponent is not fast and is shooty and wants to hang back, right? But in such a situation, this is probably how I would move my spears on turn 1. Let's consider a different situation. I'm going to move them back. Let's imagine a circumstance in which I'm up against an opponent who is fast and does have units that are a credible melee threat that maybe are as fast as my spears, in which case I'm going to hold my spears back. One of the most common mistakes that new players to 40K make, especially players who are coming from earlier editions, especially much earlier editions, is this overwhelming feeling, emotional feeling, that they absolutely must be engaging with all of their units every turn. This is the emotion that prevents people from putting Warwalkers into Deep Strike using their native Deep Strike ability, or really anything in Deep Strike other than maybe a unit of Warp Spiders or something, is the sense that they have to be shooting with everything every turn. It is also the emotion that causes players who should know better to just catapult their spears across the table at whatever they can hit on turn 1. And it is true that in earlier editions of 40K, the ability to, when there was less terrain on the table, and the game was less about objective control and secondary objectives and more about target elimination, it did feel at times a little bit like, I think the comparison I made in a recent blog post was like some sort of Napoleonic battle in which it's just about leveraging more firepower. So if you're soldiers can fire 3 shots a minute and they can only fire 2 shots a minute, you win. But the 40k equivalent of that is I'm shooting with everything on this turn before you are shooting with everything or engaging with everything. And that's just not how 9th edition works. So you may find that you don't use your spears on turn 1. And you may find that you don't use your spears on turn 2. And you may even find that one unit of 3 elf spear unit doesn't do anything on turn 3. And that is okay. It's good. It's Craftworld Eldar excel in the late game. The early game is about survival and picking up a few points and trying to gain some sort of numerical advantage on the table with reference to relative power and positioning. Your elves are fragile. If you move them all into line of sight of your opponent in a pure Craftworld's lists, you're likely to lose the game. So you have to hold back, create an advantage for yourself. They may outscore you on primaries on turn 2, and maybe even turn 3, and then on turns 4 and 5, you should really be, and hopefully turn 3. You should be dominating the table. When it goes well, that's typically how it looks. So you may have to hold your spears back, and this is so hard, I think, for a lot of players, and it is also the single most important principle to learn in order to get the most out of your spears. All the other stuff that I've talked about with the most advantageous builds and which Exarch powers are most optimal, and I guess we talked a little bit about Supreme Disdain. Sometimes Supreme Disdain is totally worth it. Making those sorts of decisions, that's all good, but the single most important principle is knowing when to commit your spears and when to hold back with them. And that the time to commit them is when a target presents itself that is either tactically necessary to eliminate, either from a scoring perspective, I have to get rid of that objective holder, or from a threat perspective. Maybe there's a unit that is just a significant threat to your army. Either maybe it's a fast, aggressive flying unit that can be on your backfield Night Spinners next turn, or maybe it's a unit of Space Marine Eradicators or something that just hits super hard, and it has to die. So you wait until there's a credible target that your spears can eliminate, and then you hit that target and you aim to make the trade. Now, if sometimes, right, an opponent will make a player and put something into position where you can eliminate it with a unit of spears and not actually risk the spears at all. And that's just, in which case, of course, you do it. It's a freebie. That's great. Most savvy players will make you trade your spears. So let's imagine that I'm playing a Drukhari player and he has a bunch of Reaver jet bikes, and those are pretty cool. I need to know distances, right? And I need to know what kind of charge I can pull off. So maybe he puts 6 Reavers. Let's see. Can you see this on the camera? I'm going to do, I think the far away objective is actually a better example. It's a more likely play for an opponent to make. But maybe I wait for an opponent to move these 6 Reaver jet bikes onto this objective. Maybe they kill some unit that was there. Maybe I was holding it with Storm Guardians with Celestial Shield, and I worked out that I know that he can get in there with his Reaver jet bikes and eliminate my Storm Guardians because Celestial Shield doesn't work in melee. But I also happen to know that I have 3 Shining Spears in reserve that now can very easily 16-inch move. I can position myself so I can't fail the charge. I make the move. I shoot them with the lances. I shoot them with the Shuriken catapults. I use expert crafters in the shooting phase, and then I charge them, and I use expert crafters again in the fight phase, and I definitely wipe the. Even if he had 9 of those things, they're done. That's a good use of spears. And now, yes, my spears are on the objective. Now they're exposed. But against 9 Reaver jet bikes, assuming that they don't even have good loadouts, those things are 20 points a model. So, that's a 180 point unit. And they probably have a couple of heavy weapons, Dark Lances or something. But even against a 180 point unit, well, I've just traded a 110 point unit for a 180 point unit. And I've also eliminated a significant threat and reestablished control of my own backfield. So that's the kind of trade potentially that you're going to want to make with your spears that's really effective. The other way to position spears we talked about is as deep strikers. So let's just imagine for a moment that instead the target is some monster. I'm going to throw down a Tyranid Swarm Lord. It's like the infantry commander version of the Hive Tyrant. I like this model just conceptually. And let's imagine that in this situation, I've got my, let's say he's not on an objective. This is not an objective in the middle of the table map, but this is the kind of unit, right, that is going to be super important to my opponent, because in addition to just being a terrifying monster with good defensive stats and good offensive stats, additionally, the Swarm Lord provides buffs. It allows you to like catapult units of Gene Stealers at your opponent. It has all sorts of, the Tyranids have to stay within a certain synaptic range of their commander models in order to not just become mindless beasts. So it's a synapse model. If I can take that out, it's a big deal. So in the shooting phase, I have to look at removing some unit that maybe is providing a bubble, a denial bubble that will prevent me from deep striking. So I plan this a turn out, right? I wipe out a unit of termagants or something to create an opportunity to bring in deep strikers. Hopefully I found a way to set this up effectively. And let's imagine I bring in my 5 spears, right? And I bring them in 9 inches. We're caught up. I bring them in 9 inches from my target. And I have had to think carefully about this before placing them, because I'm going to cast Ghost Walk on them. We're imagining that this unit is not an Expert Rider unit. Instead, it's a Swooping Dive unit. So they've got +1 to charge. And my Warlock, I need to think in the movement phase before I bring them in about making sure my Warlock is within range of the unit to cast Ghost Walk. And what I'm going to do is pop Seer Council, the stratagem that provides +1 to cast to both the Warlock and a nearby Farseer. I've probably given my Warlock, made him the Warlord and given him, or her, or they, Seer of the Shifting Vector, which is a Warlord trait that provides a reroll in on each turn to almost anything you want to reroll. And it's nice to give this to your Warlock because your Farseer already has an inbuilt reroll for psychic powers. So I can probably, with my +1 and my free reroll, I can probably succeed on Ghost Walk. And then all I need to do is get to a 6 on my charge, and I'm going to imagine that I have a command reroll in my back pocket for that too. So just for kicks, I'll roll it. I'm rolling 2 dice. I've rolled a single d6 twice because I only had 1 at the table. I've rolled an 8, so it would be very easy for me to now get in with my spears. Now, because this is a higher toughness model, the other thing that I'm going to want to do in the psychic phase is either put Doom on the Swarm Lord, because remember, most of my spears are strength 6. On the charge, only my Exarch carrying that lance is strength 8, and therefore these higher toughness targets, you're either going to want to put Doom on them, or you are going to want to put Empower on the spears to give them a bonus to wound. Doom lets you reroll all of the wound rolls. Empower gives you +1 to wound. So those 6s can then wound a T7 or T8 unit on a 4+, which is great. Again, something like the Swarm Lord, the other thing you want to do, occasionally this comes up, you need to jinx the target. So in this case, hopefully I've got maybe a Spirit Seer with some Wraith Blades, or I have a Wraith Seer out of line of sight somewhere. I have some other unit that has access to Runes of Battle that can cast Jinx on the target. And what Jinx does is it subtracts 1 from, here, I'm going to try to zoom in here. Seeing the camera, it's really far away. What it's going to do is provide -1 to the die that my opponent rolls for the armor save, so it does affect invulns. And this Tyranid model in particular, the Swarm Lord, I'm pretty sure it has a 3-up invuln specifically in melee, not against shooting, but only in melee. I might be wrong about that. I pretty rarely play my Tyranids at this point. But if you're dealing with anything that has better than a 4-up invuln, you really do need to get Jinx on there too. So the point of this is when you make this kind of charge, right, you need to think about, or when you make this kind of play, you need to think about the other buffs that the spears are going to need in order to achieve the objective. I really, again, once I've hit this unit, if I don't kill it, it's going to kill me. So I need to take it out. So I'm going to get some kind of reroll going in melee. Hopefully I'm going to get Jinx on there. And in this situation, I would also pop Supreme Disdain. So every 6 I roll generates an additional attack, and hopefully that takes me over the edge and gives me enough to put it down. Now, if worst case scenario, I probably still do enough damage to it that I can take it out next turn. But the problem with failing to kill something in the fight phase, every other phase, you may have another opportunity, right? So like in the psychic phase, if I don't kill something with smite, I can use another psychic power, or I can kill it in the shooting phase. In the shooting phase, if I target a unit and my Dark Reapers roll statistically unlikely bad dice and they don't take it out, well, I can target it with something else if it really needs to die. In the fight phase, that's not true. Occasionally, I guess, when you have a unit engaged with multiple enemy units. But generally, when you commit to something in the fight phase, you've committed to killing that thing or doing a certain amount of damage to that thing. And then if the dice don't go your way, there isn't like a backdoor way to fix it, or to reallocate resources. So you really do, when you commit to killing something in the fight phase that maybe is a little bit of a challenge, a unit like this with an invuln, you do want to pull out some of the stops to make it extra statistically likely, which is why something like Supreme Disdain or those psychic powers that increase your likelihood to wound or whatever, even if it seems like overkill, it's probably worth doing if the unit really needs to die. Okay, so that's spears. The takeaway here, I think, is that probably the most optimal spear builds are either 3 spear MSU units with skilled rider, maybe lancer, in a list with craft, or maybe the native Exarch power, expert hunter, in a list with expert crafters and hunters of ancient relics. And those units are going to specialize in punching your opponent off of objectives, and you want to hold them out of line of sight and play conservatively with them until there is a target that they can hit and eliminate. Your other option is to run somewhere between 5 or 7 spears in a squad, and then you have a wider variety of target options. You don't only target things on objectives primarily. You can hit anything with equal force. But the trade-off is what you can reasonably trade them for. Now the bar is higher, right? They need to do more damage to earn their value than the smaller MSU spear units. So you have to think about them differently. And then the additional complexity comes in when you start making plans about how you're going to make that work. So do I empower them? Do I cast Doom on the target? You can. Do I commit Supreme Disdain? Do I spend the CP for that? And that's going to depend on the probability of eliminating the target. You need to make sure you position your psychers to provide those buffs. And then the last note with spears, I mentioned in the beginning that Quicken, the turn 1 vault across the table 9 spear Quicken charge, is not a great build for spears. That's probably not the way to go. However, Quicken is it's just a fabulous option for spears. And your opponent may make a play error. Maybe it's not the turn 1 charge, but maybe on turn 3, your opponent just kind of gets busy with other things, forgets that Quicken exists, and leaves some essential HQ unit vulnerable to a Quicken charge. And this even good players make this kind of play error often. There's just too much to keep track of in 40k. So this is one tactic I haven't talked about a great deal, but having Quicken in your psychic arsenal. Again, one of the hard things about using spears effectively is thinking about these synergies. And if you've already got Doom and you've got Empower or Protect Jinx, and maybe you've even got Empower, you probably have to choose between Empower and Quicken. And between the two, I think Quicken is usually the better bet. But the ability to nip in there, hit an essential unit, and sort of assassinate it with Quicken, again, not necessarily a turn 1 charge. Maybe you're doing it on turn 5, but Quicken increases the movement range of the spears from 16 to 32. There's very little on the board that you can't threaten. And so that's the last sort of use for spears, is to just suddenly appear elsewhere on the table. The other way you can get them into position is to fire and fade, but you can't. So you move them, you shoot something that's 12 inches away with shuriken catapults, use fire and fade. That one is not as reliable because early in 8th edition, I don't remember if it was from the beginning or if they FAQ'd it early in 8th, but you cannot charge after, or maybe it's just on the stratagem card. I don't remember now, but you can't charge after you fire and fade. But that's a good positioning trick. But the ultimate positioning trick is to use Quicken, and it can just be a hugely powerful tool, and it adds this addition. So in addition to punching enemy units off of objectives, eliminating infantry, light infantry, heavy infantry, bikes, harder targets with the right buffs, now also we're character assassins, or maybe we're taking out a backline heavy support infantry unit, some other factions equivalent of Dark Reapers, because it's been left unprotected and you make a 32-inch move. So that's I think the final play with spears. They can also help you score the secondary objective, engage on all fronts, simply by being in certain places on the table. They're not, because you're positioning your spears with an eye towards target elimination, you don't want to rely on them to do that, right? You definitely don't want to just move 3 spears into your opponent's table quadrant on turn 1 to max out your score for engage on all fronts and then watch them get massacred. Like, that's what Vipers and Wind Riders are for. You don't want to be doing with, they're too expensive for that, too valuable for that. But I think that brings us to the end of the spear video. I hope to have another video up in the next few days. If you liked this video, please say so in the comments below and click like. If you have other ideas about how to use spears effectively in competitive play, please leave your thoughts below. And if you have preferences for the video that I do next, feel free to state those also. Thanks, guys. I will look forward to seeing you next time.